Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So perhaps the most commonly offered therapy on the NHS is cognitive behavioural therapy. So people often have some sense of what CBT looks like. But what do alternatives such as psychodynamic psychotherapy look like? Well, today's guest is Toby Ingham, who's written a book, Guilty Victim, that provides quite a detailed account of psychotherapy with one man. I'm really pleased to have you along today, Toby, to talk about it.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Hi, Toby. Thanks so much for coming along today. So you've written a book summarising your work with one particular client, William. The book is called A Guilty Victim. What was it about William's journey through therapy that seemed so powerful that you were inspired to write a book?
Well, the interesting question. I suppose one of the things was that by the time we got to the end of the work, William was interested in me writing a book about it. And so that introduced the idea that I might have permission. Well, I did have permission to write about the work. Typically it's one doesn't get permission to do things, so you don't do them. And a lot of case studies tend to be written through some sort of disguising, and they tend to be based around vignettes. And this, I felt, was an opportunity to tell a fuller story than that. Plus, the interesting thing one of the interesting things that had happened in the work was that William had produced a timeline. The book is subtitled Recovering Creativity After Trauma and Abuse. And part of the recovering of the creativity, just to give you a taster, was that William produced this very detailed, can you see that okay? Timeline, a codex, as I understand it can be referred to, of his life. And so I had a structure that I could think about hanging a book around, because in a long therapy, there's so much information, it's very difficult to know quite how to structure it. But this answered that question. So those are a few of the reasons. Yeah.
Well, as you say, a terribly important opportunity. How did you feel about it at the time?
What about being asked to write?
Yes.
Well, at first I was dubious, and I put this in the book. I wondered about the ethical position. A psychotherapy works significantly because it's a confidential relationship, and so what would it mean to try and make that public? And I went through quite a bit of research, looking at case studies, looking at ethical codes, thinking of how it might work. But in the end, it seemed that there was an opportunity to kind of collaborate on this project, in that I decided that if I was going to try and write it, I'd have to make sure that at the same time as I was writing it, William wasn't suffering some kind of regression himself. And so periodically I would check with him material I was writing, and the relationship changed into post-therapy, this loose contact where I'd send him some information that I'd written based around one of those slides I've shown you. And that's how it progressed. I found it very challenging to know how to structure the book. I mean, it's taken about 6 years from the end of that formal work to heading to March 13th when the book is published. And one of the things that I struggled with was what was the right form. And I didn't want to write a book that was just for psychotherapists. I mean, I've got lots of those kinds of books, but I didn't want to write one of those. I didn't want to write a book that was full of jargon, really I wanted to write a book that would be of use possibly to a victim. And that might be someone anywhere who could resonate with this narrative that was in this story. And so I tried to find a structure that would, on the one hand, I used information from sessions, so kind of verbatims. And then instead of describing in a kind of he said way, I used a device of a narrative device really, to try and tell what had happened, to try and show what had happened in a kind of longhand cinematic way where possible.
It's one of the things I think you do very well, actually, Toby, because when I was reading the book, I was trying to think, well, okay, who's this book got real appeal for? And I thought, actually, anyone who's considering therapy and trying to think about the different kinds of talking therapies that are available. And like I said in the intro, most people have got an idea about CBT because it is the most commonly offered therapy, certainly on the NHS. But actually, when people think about the alternatives, what does that look like? And I also think there's a real candidness about things that happen during therapy, like, for instance, the person who's coming for therapy getting quite annoyed with the therapist at times, the fact that there's the playing out in therapy, aspects of other relationships might be brought into the therapeutic relationship. And I think the level of detail in the book is such that you have you're able to see what that might be like. You're able to develop an understanding of why that might be therapeutically useful. And so I think it's not only a book that's perhaps useful for people thinking about starting therapy, but also for trainee therapists to think about, well, all right, what might this look like in therapy?
Yes, I mean, I felt it was important to try and tell the story of the work, and to try and do that in as honest and open a way as I could. And right from the beginning, William was someone who challenged me on how I'd set up my room, and he did so in a good way, really. I mean, or good, appropriate way. He was challenging. And I thought, you could write this book and remove those things, or you could include them and see how that tells the story. Because really, being a therapist isn't about, a kind of perfection of response and so forth. I mean, I think timekeeping is pretty essential and some other frame issues. But by and large, what happens in a therapeutic relationship, does involve a lot of jeopardy, a lot of moments where the client might think about breaking off, and these things all have to be navigated. And I think that a lot of therapy, maybe most therapy, that's a broad statement, but ends prematurely. I think a lot of times people give up on the kind of energy to stick with something and repeat a cycle that breaks down rather than be able to follow it through. The interesting thing here was that we somehow, between the two of us, we were able to stick at something. And there were various moments which, are revealed in the book when his early childhood vulnerability leads to his peril at school and being picked out and groomed and so on. At all of these moments, the therapy could have fallen apart. There was this kind of a sequence. And I hope that I've shown that is how a therapy develops, certainly how this one developed.
Yeah, I think you kind of like to show that that's a normal part of therapy. And I think, role modelling appropriate expectations that actually therapists can manage, some criticism, some anger. Not that that means that it's fair to be a free for all, but actually that as a therapist you try and make sense of those things happening. And actually therapy can be too cozy, can't it? Where somebody might not feel able to really voice what they're feeling, or the therapist might not pick up on some of those challenges and just find ways to people please, I guess.
Yes, I mean, I think there was a particular opportunity in this work. As I say, we managed to to stick together through the points of jeopardy. And we, from the beginning, there was this issue about William, not the real name, it's a disguised name, but William had these prohibitions in his mind. And whenever he thought of, for example, something of a creative project, a thought would come in and say, well, that's not for you. And the timeline that I showed you earlier, which is a very detailed thing, it took a long time for it to be possible to start to piece together the elements on that timeline. I tend to think that a lot of people come to see me or go to see therapists with an idea that there's something wrong with them. And to my mind, it's less that there's something wrong with us. It's more that things have happened to us. The thing is, particularly after trauma, I think it's easy to lose sight of what's happened to us. And so one of my hopes with the book is that, anybody might draw out their own timeline and start to see what happened in their original birth family and what were the moments around maybe primary, secondary, school, and so on, and, develop more of an understanding.
Thank you. Toby, can you give us a brief summary of William's story?
Okay, so when I met him, he was around 50 and he was suffering with low mood and drinking too much and was overweight. He was a successful man and a family man, but he could only have pleasure by doing things for other people. He could have no pleasure for himself. If there was any idea to follow an impulse, to draw a picture, to whatever it might be, these would be closed down, as I said. And we began from that point. In terms of his story, what emerged was that there had been problems in his birth family that, might be recognizable kind of in any family, I guess, but perhaps more traumatic in his. And these, at an early age, had left him in a vulnerable position. And that set a sort of chain of events in motion for what came in his life. So at no point could he have anything that was satisfying. And that became part of the therapy. So at any moment that there was anything, any kind of scintilla of the therapy providing something for him, these would be moments when he would likely have a reaction to say he should stop. Does that answer the question enough in terms of explaining something about him?
Yes, it's a fascinating teaser for the book, which of course comes out.
It's certainly easier to read you the book, but that would take a long time.
So what do you think William was hoping for in sharing his story in this way?
Well, when he came to see me, rather like you were saying earlier, Naomi, he was really looking for a kind of quick fix. He was looking for strategies to stop this negative thinking so that he would be free to live a more satisfying life. And quite quickly, I mean, almost from the perhaps even from the first session, we found ourselves in a sort of tussle when I picked up a word. He explained to me that he thought that everything had gone wrong for him when he was, I think, about 14. He'd fallen out with some children at this peer group at school. And he used the word emulating. He said that he was emulating this group to fit in. And somehow I was intrigued with this use of the word emulating, and it set my mind on a train of thought that I wondered if he'd learnt to do this imitation before he was 13, 14. And that really became the beginning of an investigation of what had happened before school. But was the thread we followed. I think I've lost the thread of your question, though. Where were we at that point?
Well, actually, what you were saying was very interesting, because it was about William's, at what point in his life did William develop this pattern of trying to fit in and therefore emulating the patterns of behaviour of others.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So his idea when I met him was that this was something that was going on at his boarding school. As we pulled at this thread of imitation, it emerged that there was a much older original point at which he started imitating to fit in and present a kind of false self, which would mask and defend, a more authentic, true self type experience. And there was one picture he drew, which I can see if I can. I can show you it, but it's a bit titchy on this. I don't know if you can see this folded up triangle. So that was the first picture that was drawn, and it was just on its own. It was on a Post-it note, and I was shown that sometime into the work. It's an image of a person folded in on themselves. It's an intriguing little picture, and it was shown to me on a Post-it note and then sort of whipped away. And but it was these moments of where the creative expression would have a tiny bit of room that just gave us a bit more oxygen to follow something and carry on. And if you look at this timeline now, I mean, it's covered with pictures. So this was just like this one little molecule that made it, and others followed in due course. But that's how we managed to progress things bit by bit.
Thank you. So you've already mentioned that William went to boarding school, and we've spoken to many people who have had quite challenging experiences at boarding school, and I think you indicate that there was something about an exchange of letters from his parents or with his parents that was particularly significant. What was the significance of those letters?
So what happens is that he's very alone at the school, and writes. The school is in Ireland. His family live in England, and he writes home and asks for help, and he gets almost by reply the opposite, gets a rejection, gets told to stop sending letters like this home. They upset us, something to that effect. So it was a letter that really struck to the heart, I think. And he tried again at another point, and that time his father comes to the school. He thinks he's being rescued, but actually what happens is his father is there for other reasons. He's kind of come over on a social visit, and he tells William that he's not leaving the school. He's going to have to, kind of, what would you say, suck it up and get on with it. And so the letters mark these moments of rejection, isolation, and aloneness.
They are actually really heartbreaking to read, being accused of being emotionally blackmailing. But I mean, you do within the book sort of detail some of his early years anyway, and how emotionally absent his parents might have been. But I think even that snapshot of the letters says a lot about the family.
Yes, I mean, I would agree. I think to William, it was incomprehensible that he has children, and he's someone that if a child of his wrote a letter saying they were in trouble, he'd be in the car off to get them, faster than you could get a letter back. So I think what was going on in his own family was a very sad, neglectful tale.
Building on that, another very poignant element to his story is how those tiny rejections crush his spirit. Are you able to say a little bit about this and why it was so important to include that? Some of them are so small that might not have seemed important enough to include, but actually when you start seeing a pattern of these tiny rejections.
I think they all serve to reinforce the idea that he's bad and that there's something wrong with him. And anything that the world does that to reject is never taken as a sign of a problem with the world. It's always taken as a sign of a problem with me or with William. And I think that that's something that victims, and particularly perhaps people who've been, picked out, groomed, abused, and so forth, I think victims would resonate with that story, that they do see rejection in small things, and these rejections prove their kind of core badness. And of course, that then becomes something that the therapy has to survive, because if you have the narrative he's working to is that there's something wrong with him, he'll have to go off. There's nothing wrong with my therapy. He's the person that's getting in the way of any kind of progress, and so forth.
And you've already touched on the importance of the word emulating being crucial to William's story, but I wondered whether you had any thoughts on its significance for other boarding school survivors.
Well, as the book's neared publication, I've been fortunate enough to cross paths with some boarding school survivor groups, Seen and Heard, for example, Piers Cross, and his Evolving Man podcast. I think this book does have it's true that it is a boarding school story, and I think it does have or may have a resonance for people who were at boarding schools, particularly boarding schools in perhaps the 70s and the 80s, maybe earlier, maybe a bit later. But I wasn't really aiming exclusively at a book that was for victims of people who'd been to boarding schools. I felt that this was as applicable to, anyone who'd been a victim in any kind of situation where safeguarding had failed them and their vulnerability had been picked out by, some perpetrator. And indeed that does happen in this story, and it does happen in a boarding school. But I think, therefore, it may be a story that has relevance and resonance for boarding school survivors and boarding school ex-boarders. But I hope it has relevance and resonance beyond that.
Thank you. What impact did William's experience of abuse and neglect have on his ability to be creative?
I think it had a profound effect. It reinforced so the title of the book, A Guilty Victim, and victims aren't supposed to be guilty, are they? But I think it had a very profound effect on his ability to have anything of value for himself. Any creative expression, as I say, would be met with a sort of prohibitive thought. And that wasn't just drawing a picture. It might be the idea that he could go for a run, which there is a story about that in the book. But any potential hobby that, let's say, if he met someone and they liked doing something, if William thought, oh, I think I'd like to do that, almost immediately a thought would say, well, you can't. That's not for you. That's for other people. You don't deserve that. And I think that whole experience of being picked out and abused and groomed and abused really reinforced these notions.
And how was reconnecting with his creativity important for William's healing?
I think very important. I've thought about this quite a bit throughout the process and as we're nearing publication, because one of the moments I think that allowed the development of interest in his creativity occurred in a session he brought some pictures he'd been working on. We were a long way into the work by now, and he was struggling with how to show me the pictures or where to put them. And I suggested he put them on the desk and we could look at them together, which was an uncharacteristic thing really for me to do. And, you know, he wouldn't have expected it to happen, and indeed didn't. As it turned out, I think it made a profound impact on him that I was interested to look at the pictures with him. In a way, it became a kind of opposite of the father rejecting him at school in Ireland when he was 13, 14. But it meant that he could follow the creative project further. And, you know, we had some interesting luck in that there was quite a bit of attention on the Bayeux Tapestry. And that the Bayeux Tapestry is a kind of model of the codex that William went on to create. And that intrigued him. So he started to see that if he did draw this timeline and linked up the events that led to bad things, it made sense to him. And instead of him thinking that everything was his fault and he'd done something today to cause a bad thing, he could see more clearly that actually that wasn't the case, that there was a chain of events. So I think being able to recover the creativity is a significant part of the story.
You're also highlighting as well, I guess, some of the sort of what gets referred to as reparenting within therapeutic relationship as well, that those missed opportunities during childhood. So in this case, parents showing an interest in artistic ability or something that you've produced, actually people can have an experience that emulates what they should have had during childhood, that interest that could have happened and should have happened when he was younger.
Yes.
But you're kind of giving an example of that. So, I mean, as we've spoken about, the book not only shares William's story, but it does also provide quite a detailed account of the therapeutic process. How exposing was it for you to commit this to paper for others to read about?
Well, it as I say, I spent a long time trying to work out how to write the book and what structures work, and I, you know, so I would say in terms of revealing of me, probably more than I realise. But I think I've always felt open to thinking things through rather than jumping to defensive positions too quickly. And I trusted that in the writing of it, that not to get bogged down in trying to hide things, that actually revealing mistakes or revealing tensions or revealing I don't know what were natural. I mean, whatever people might think about how a long psychotherapy happens, this was the experience, and so let's share it and see what people make of it. I mean, I'm yet to tell, but early, people who have read it have been interested, and that's really a big part of what I wanted. At a sort of micro level, just to share a thought about this with you, I had one of the technical problems was how to include myself, and you see, for the first, I don't meet William until he's about 50. So when I wrote, as I structured the book, the sessions take place in the present chronologically, but they are interspersed with flashbacks going right back to the beginning of this timeline. So it's say from about 2 years old to the present day. And when I was writing it at first, the flashbacks only involve William. But as you get further along, and in fact, this happens in the timeline, and the book is the timeline was a very helpful structure. But as it goes along, you'll see here that the therapy starts. So as the therapy began, and I'm then in the picture at the bottom, the man in the bottom. So once the therapy had begun within the narratives, it then felt a kind of uncomfortable or something like that to have William reflecting on Toby. So I found myself reaching for a third person fictional version of me to take care of that. And so, and I don't know what people would say about this, but so I decided to, because I was giving William a pseudonym, I thought, well, I'll give myself a pseudonym throughout the book. And that, I think adds to adds to the creative project. But I think it has been revealing. But as I say, I felt that's okay because I saw a program about post-Savile, and in the program there was a woman, and she was talking about having been abused when she was about 2, or a very early age, by her grandfather, and she said that she felt she had the word victim tattooed on her forehead, and it made a very powerful impression on me. And really, I felt this book is for her. Nothing would make me happier than to know what she thinks about this book. So I don't think it matters that, I've revealed that, I put silly pictures up on walls or whatever. I think that's not so important, but we'll see.
And can I also ask, how involved was William in the actual creative process, in terms of collaboration? How involved was he? Did he get to comment on each chapter, or did he wait till you'd written it all and then comment? How did that work?
So the way it worked was that I wrote and would periodically check what he made of the way I was putting it together. Mm-hmm. As I say, I wanted to check at all times that he wasn't regressing while I was having a great time writing a book for myself. Mm-hmm. And I felt that if there was any sign that he was not doing well, then this couldn't work. But I think it has, the way I've found to do this is as a kind of collaboration. It didn't feel right to me to say, okay, well, I'll write the book, goodbye. You can go and buy a copy when it comes out in 6 years' time. That felt wrong. What felt right to me was to check what he thought. And so I would send him bits of material, and he would tell me what he thought. This would happen via email. And I found it was helpful, I think. So I think it's been collaborative. I think he has been involved. And I think better about maybe the ethical questions because of that. But I don't know what other people might say.
Well, no, because it had me thinking about when I've been at conferences and seen, admittedly, sort of older generationed therapists like Beck or whoever showing videos of clients in therapy, and also the trend to have a camera in therapeutic space more recently, and I feel quite uncomfortable about that, because actually how much control does the person the patient, how much control do they actually have? Whereas I think in the writing of a book, I mean, you've already said it took 6 years for starters, but there's a longer process, isn't there, where it's possible to review. And I mean, that's one of the things when we do this podcast, we always send the conversation to the guest before it goes out for public consumption, to make sure that the guest's happy with how they're appearing. And I can see in a book that's very easy for that to happen, but I wonder how much control people have when they're appearing as patients in other ways and might not really realise how vulnerable they could be when their story is out in the world in a different way. So for me, it felt quite an ethical way of allowing people to have an insight or understanding into a process rather than having a camera in the room.
Yes, I would feel, I mean, I don't think I'd feel comfortable myself to work in that way. But obviously, I've learnt a lot over the years reading case studies, but a lot of them leave you feeling a bit uneasy about to what extent did people know. I mean, the Lang and Esterson case study, Sanity, Madness and the Family, I found tremendously interesting. But there is a sense in it that the women, the families didn't know what was happening. And there isn't a sense that the work that was written, which is so helpful for readers like me, did very much for the women or the families that were in the book. And another book, Dibs in Search of Self, I think that's a great book, but again, I'm not sure quite that, Dibs is a young boy. What permissions could he give? The Freud case studies, where everything kind of begins in my training, fascinating studies, but again, it's not quite clear how some of the ethics around confidentiality or permissions was given. So it seemed to, I mean, it's funny because I really, this is part of why it took 6 years. I was anxious about, and I put this in the book, that is there, would people say I've got William to do something for me, given me a book to write? And it took me a long time to think that actually a collaboration, something that has the patient client not exactly lead, but partly lead, well, collaborative idea is the only way to do it.
And, just to say, how grateful we should be really for William wanting to share his story in this way, because I think, it does offer the possibility of helping other people. So thank you.
Yes, I mean it's a tough read in parts, but it is ultimately a redemptive story, and like I say, my hope is that victims from any kind of background might resonate with this.
Mm.
So, Toby, you've given us so much in this conversation, not least in what's been a description really of the complexity of the human mind, because you've been telling us that as well as doing your work, leading your normal social life, I hope, you've been working away on this particular task, which involves thinking, planning at a conscious level, and then chewing over and processing at a subconscious and unconscious level until it coalesces into the final product. It's a remarkable account. So thanks very much for that.
I think people might be surprised to realize how much they are on therapists' minds. That when we work with people, it's we take the work very seriously. But in terms of this story, I went on after I'd managed to get the publishing offer with Karnak. I remember realizing on a holiday that it was the first holiday I'd been on where I hadn't just been writing this book. Wherever I've gone, I've had the laptop writing the book for forever, and now we're in a different space. We're heading towards March 13th, and the ideas that have just been in my head or my head and William's head. Now there's an opportunity to see what people think, and I'm let's see.
It's such an important point, though, isn't it? Because I think, especially in private practice where people are paying for their therapy, there can be this idea that it is just a transaction, and actually therapists, generally are hugely invested in their clients. There's a lot of love that goes into the therapeutic relationship, and you can hear that in the attention that you've given to William's story and the fact that you have spent so much time thinking about him.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
So, Toby, you've been doing this work for quite some time. You would have heard a number of powerfully challenging and sad stories. How do you look after yourself and cope with the emotional demands of the work?
Well, I suppose that's partly down to the experience of doing the work the training and the supervision that I have. But I suppose to be more revealing, I suppose I'd say that I think what drew me into psychoanalytic work and psychotherapy really was something to do with trying to understand my own experience of emotional stability. And it might sound strange, but to sit down with someone who is taking their own emotional stability or instability very seriously is a privilege. And so there may be stories that or things that are more difficult to listen to and to share. But I think the sincere act of being able to have an open conversation within the confidentiality of the room, of the frame is a privilege. It's but I have supervision, and I've been, for me, being in I've worked running counselling services, I've worked running trainings, and I still try to contribute like that. And I find that as an ongoing engagement, so being engaged with people who are training, and I think because when you're in private practice, you can end up quite isolated and without a community. And I think it is incumbent, certainly for me, so I'll say perhaps for others as well, to work out what kind of community you can have, what's necessary around you, that so you can share, the slings and arrows that are just an ordinary part of the strange kind of adventure that being a psychotherapist is.
Toby, thanks very much indeed. Thanks very much for that conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toby.
Thank you.
Sorry.